Welcome to Season 7, Episode 3 of Solarpunk Presents. Today, I'm talking to my childhood friend, Chie Furuya, about her family's experience of being forcibly relocated and incarcerated in concentration camps, generally more euphemistically referred to as internment camps or relocation camps, during World War II. Hello everyone and welcome to the episode. Don't forget to join our Patreon or subscribe to our YouTube channel. We need and appreciate your support. And today I want to talk about demonizing, forcibly relocating, and incarcerating groups of people that you can easily recognize as being other. Right? So we just keep doing this over and over again. Like pretty much an entire quadrant of my family died in concentration camps in Europe during World War II. And I'm really looking on in horror that we're kind of revving up Guantanamo to, take tens of thousands of perceived illegal immigrants that we are rounding up very cruelly and shipping off to this, what is really kind of a legal limbo for them. And, I grew up knowing a lot of Japanese Americans, and I'm pretty sure all of their families had people in them, the parents or the grandparents or both, who had spent time in these what we used to call internment camps, but really are a type of concentration camp on U.S. soil during World War II. And that's what I want to talk about today. To start with some background, between 1869 and 1924, a couple 100,000 Japanese people emigrated to the United States, taking up residence mainly in Hawaii and the western continental U.S. This did not go over well in the western continental U.S., giving rise to howls of protest and fear-mongering that hordes of Asians, the so-called Yellow Peril, would take over white-owned farms and businesses. And bear in mind that, at this time, the U.S. genocide of Native Americans was only just winding down. Or, you could also say it was in full swing if you want to include the continuing cultural genocide of these peoples. The furor against the Japanese immigrants was such that by 1924, the U.S. passed the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Asian Exclusion Act, that prevented further immigration from Asia. As Japan's imperial power grew in the 1930s, the Office of Naval Intelligence began surveilling Japanese American communities in Hawaii. President Roosevelt, who was no fan of Asians, had them draw up a list of the specific Japanese Americans who would be first rounded up and incarcerated in concentration camps, and that was the word he used, in the event of the outbreak of hostilities between the U.S. and Japan. Cut to December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii that wiped out a good chunk of the U.S. Navy's vessels and killed 2,403 Americans. Japan declared war on the U.S. and the British Empire later that day. Within hours, the first Japanese Americans were rounded up in Hawaii and imprisoned in high-security camps. It took a few months to prepare the camps for what was to come, and the first Japanese Americans were sent from Washington State to Manzanar in California on March 24th, 1942. By August, most Japanese Americans in the western U.S. had been rounded up and imprisoned. This included the grandparents, parents, and a few other relatives of my childhood friend, Chie Furuya. What they went through and how they survived it is what I want to talk to her about today. So my friend Chie has, she's kind of two stories to tell because she's got two sides to her family, her mother's side and her father's side. And they were separate at those times because her parents were just little children, just little babies, really, at that time. And so she's got two different stories here to tell. The first story I've asked her about is her mother's side.
For my mother's side, my grandmother went with my mother and her brother. So the three of them went to Gila, Arizona.
So where was your grandmother living?
Okay, so my grandmother was living actually in Seattle, Washington.
In the city itself?
Yes. And before the war had started, had decided that her husband at the time was not a suitable partner anymore because of his gambling. And so she took my mother and went to Los Angeles I've always heard this story, but it hasn't been until very recent as a middle-aged adult. And I've read so much about women in previous generations and really how little agency they had, how few legal rights they had. It was not apparent to me as a kid how bold of a move that was at that time. And so she arrived in Los Angeles, and my uncle was a houseboy at the time. So he was living with a kind Christian family who gave him room and board in exchange for chores while he went to school. And then he worked, I believe, two other jobs besides that to try and make ends meet to pay for tuition and whatnot.
And
And
so this
so,
is before the war.
yes, this is before the war.
Okay.
And then when war broke out, then they left for camp.
So your grandmother, your mother, and your mother's uncle ended up together in a camp in Gila, Arizona, and that must have been really hot. So, how old was your grandmother at this point? And how old was your
That's
mother?
That's a really great question. So my mother was quite young. She was born in 1940, so she was just a few years old. So when Japanese Americans would meet each other, and then through conversation somehow they find out like, oh, you're also Japanese American. Oh, what camp were you at? So they just call it camp. What like summer camp, Girl Scout camp. What camp were you at? Oh, we were at Post. Oh, Post. Oh, my husband's family was at Post. Oh, really? So
Well,
funny.
it is a major commonality. Every Japanese American person I know, their parents and grandparents were in these camps. So it's yeah, I mean it's a shock, it's shocking. And it isn't talked about all that much. When did your family come over from Japan to America?
I am really terrible about dates. But grand, my grandmother's family on my dad's side, their family came over quite a while ago. They actually left their firstborn in Japan because they were worried that the trip would be too difficult for her. They said they would come back. And I think she was just a baby at the time. And she ended up being raised by relatives in Japan and stayed in Japan the rest of her life. So then they landed in the US. And then next they had my grandmother, and they had two more children in the United States. By the time war broke out, my dad had been born. The family had a dairy in what is now just south of downtown Los Angeles. And there's apparently a 7-Up factory there, or there was. Not sure if that's still there.
So I've just had a look, and according to the internet, there is still a 7-Up bottling facility at 3200 East 26th Street in Vernon, near the Los Angeles River. And so this is sort of just east of South Central LA and very, very close to downtown LA.
Lucky or not lucky, they were only leasing the land, so it's not as though they lost land. I know stories both of families who lost land whose neighbors said, oh, we'll take care of it for you, and they sold it off and kept the money. And there are other stories where neighbors said, we'll keep it for you, and they handed over their bank account so they could pay for property taxes, and they came back and their neighbors had honored their friendship by being true to them. So
Wow, all of that is
yes.
amazing.
Yes. So,
That
anyways, in my family, because they didn't actually own the land, but they did have, I mean, it was a fair operation. I don't actually know like the number of cows they had, but they had several families who were mostly Mexican who were working there with them. And they said they realized with the short notice, I think they had 3 days, and they had to report to the center, and they could only bring what they could carry in their hands. With the atmosphere, I think, being the way it was, I remember reading stories about people trying to sell their china or whatever, their housewares, and Americans would come and basically offer them pennies for what they were selling. And maybe this was actually in a movie. And this woman, this Japanese American woman, was so angry and so insulted by the low price that the woman offered her. She actually took the china and she smashed each piece to the ground while she was glaring at this woman because she was so insulted and was like, I would rather smash this to, you know. and make trash out of it than sell it to you for that pittance.
Christina breaking in to say that I'm pretty sure I've actually seen this incident that Chia describes, and I'm wondering if it doesn't actually come from the book and the movie Snow Falling on Cedars. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to track either of those down to check that, but I just wanted to throw that in there just in case.
It's so hard for me to imagine, and only by seeing and movies or reading stories like that can I understand how terrible and how degrading it was, and the amount of racism. I mean, my sister always says that, she, and I agree, I also kind of grew up with the stereotype in our favor, which was like, oh, you're Asian, you must be very smart. I feel lucky that I grew up in a time where Japan was very cool. Oh, Japanese food, very cool. You know, well, actually, I remember in elementary school to
Well, it
take.
depends on the generation. I
That's
mean, my
true.
dad has friends who are, if they're still alive, are very racist against Japanese people and Asians in general. I will not repeat the slurs, right? But you can imagine the things that they say.
And you're right, it's very generational. But I also feel very fortunate to have grown up in Los Angeles and, where we have a very diverse community, that there are many Asians here. So I don't stand out. And I'm not certain, but I think, but pre-COVID, we were traveling on the East Coast and down into the South. And I'm not sure, but I think maybe we got looks because we are an interracial couple. And I was like, oh, everyone's looking at us. I'm like,
Oh,
oh, were
weird.
they expecting someone? And I look behind me and I'm like, nope, us. And then I'm like, is that a friendly look? I'm like, I don't know.
Well, that's weird. I mean, because Los Angeles is very, very, very multicultural, or, however you want to say it. And it's not unusual to have mixed race families at all. I mean,
Not
we
at
already
all.
grew up with a lot of them. A lot of men who had brought home Korean wives from the Korean War. And for instance, I mean, even technically, I grew up in a mixed race family because my father's family is from Mexico and my mom comes from Europe, although it's harder to see in our case. So it's weird that there's parts of the country where that's a weird thing because it's just such a normal thing where we grew
Right.
up.
Right. And in our community, I mean, we know a lot of mixed couples, and it's
Normal.
just,
A
yes, it's
thing. It's
normal.
just you wouldn't even think about it. Actually, this reminds me. When my first year at Santa Cruz, I had a friend who's like fifth generation Japanese American, and her parents were in the camps, and grandparents as well. And because, like I said, everybody I know who's Japanese American has had their family funneled through one of these relocation camps, and she was describing her when her first what like her first semester at Santa Cruz or whatever, and walking into a class and being the only and not wanting to say anything, and she's normally very outspoken, and not wanting to say anything because she was the only non-white person in the class. And I remember looking at her like, what are you talking about? You're white, and it just never, because of growing up in Torrance, which had such a high percentage of people from Asia, especially at that time, a lot of Japanese Americans, just never occurred to me that we weren't the same race.
Well, actually, in high school, it wasn't Japanese American. I mean, the majority of the Asians were either Chinese American or, I didn't realize I knew a lot of Vietnamese American. I was just all like, they're Asian, like, I didn't know
Well,
what
in
kind
in elementary school, for me, it
of. Oh,
was
for
it was still
yes,
mostly,
elementary
and there
school.
was a lot of people who were actually Japanese, full stop,
Mhm.
who were over for like 4 years because the dad worked at Mitsubishi or whatever, and then they went back. So, but yeah, I know you're right. In high school, it was much more diverse. This is true. I don't know what drove that shift.
So going back to my dad's side though, so they had the scary. They had several families working for them and living on premise, I believe, because I think they had small, very small houses for them to live in. And so when the war came and the notices came that they needed to report to leave to go to a relocation center, they realized they couldn't take anything with them. And I think they felt very grateful for their families who had been so loyal to them.
Christina breaking in here saying that Chie also wanted me to add that by, having to interact with these families that were working for them, Chie's grandmother had also had the opportunity to learn Spanish, which she was also very grateful for.
And so they just gave away all of their things to the families, and they realized that they would also be displaced because now they would not be living here and working at this, working for them. So it
So
was it was a big shift.
okay, that is very, what's the right word? Magnanimous? That's an interesting choice. Like rather than them being angry or being bitter, you've described it, they felt grateful that they had the opportunity to share these or to give these things to the people who had supported them and had worked for them. That is not a choice most people would make.
Well, there's also in Japanese, there's a saying which is shikata ga nai, which means it can't be helped. In a book that I'm reading, Designing Your Life, they talk about gravity problems. And I know this is a paradigm that's used in other types of trainings and whatnot, but gravity problems are just things that you can't do anything about.
It's interesting because my first thought is it doesn't just have to be this way if people weren't jerks. That would be my thought. I guess that's not very helpful.
A lot of things happen because of power and money.
Yeah. So this is your father's side of the family. So there's so many amazing things here. Just the thought of there being a dairy in downtown Los Angeles is mind-blowing. Also, interesting that a Japanese family ended up running a dairy. Don't really think of dairies as being big things in Japan, especially like 100 years ago.
They're not. I don't have the exact story, but my grandfather on my mother's side was a businessman. This would actually be my mother's grandfather. He started several businesses in the Seattle area. He was actually part of an effort to introduce dairy in Japan.
And how did that go?
Oh,
Introducing,
fantastically.
really, okay, introducing dairy to a heavily lactose intolerant population.
Because you can still feed it to the kids.
All right, of course, until they're about 5, right?
But
Okay.
then they also build up, I think, a tolerance.
Yeah, if you develop the right bacteria, even if you're lactose intolerant, you can still handle some dairy. I know, like even in places like Europe, something like 65% of the population is actually lactose intolerant. They just don't know it because their gut bacteria have stepped in and are producing the enzymes. And this is
I
why
didn't know.
sometimes,
I didn't know that.
yeah, this is why sometimes later in life or like after illnesses and you can suddenly develop lactose intolerance, or and actually why lactose intolerance has degrees. And if you lose your gut flora, the right gut flora, then suddenly you can't handle dairy products anymore. So you've got these two sides of the family who've come and they have sort of, so that's what, now hang on a second. So your grandmother and your grandfather then are both in Los Angeles at the same time before the war, and they don't know each other. No, your
No,
mother and your father. Your mother and your father,
yes,
not your
yeah,
grand. Yes.
yes.
So your
And they
mother
were
and
they
your
were
father
children. They were babies. They
are
were
babies.
toddlers and
Okay, so both
small.
your mother and your father were born in Los Angeles before the war.
My mother was actually born in Seattle.
Right. Born in Seattle. Right. Born in Seattle. Okay. I'm just curious, were they living in really different parts of Los Angeles?
So my mother and grandmother went to go see my great uncle, and he was living. Actually, I don't know where they lived in Los Angeles. They
Okay.
lived in Los Angeles somewhere, and so based on where you were living, you would go. Well, but
Right.
yeah, I don't know how they separated them out. In fact, I don't even know which. I don't know which relocation center my mom went to before leaving, but my dad's family went to the Santa Anita racetracks, and they were at the racetrack for I don't know how long they lived there, but my grandmother was pregnant at the time. So they always say that that uncle was born in a horse stall, like baby Jesus.
You guys really put quite a positive spin on what must have been a very horrific and traumatic event. Like I'm having trouble imagining being put through something like this and not coming out angry and bitter and full of distrust for other human beings. But not how this is just does not sound like how either side of your family has responded to what happened to them, to this being uprooted from their lives and put in these camps with lots of other people, presumably in situations that where you don't have much privacy and you don't have much dignity. You know, I've been out to Manzanar and seen the little barracks and stuff like that. And it's, you know, if you're used to having your own personal space and your own business, and suddenly you're having to sleep in cots in these huge dormitories that are just made of wood and they're not insulated, and you're being guarded because people think you're a traitor to your own country, even if you're like a third generation immigrant, not immigrant, you know what I'm saying? And someone who was like maybe not even born here but isn't Japanese is like guarding you because you're a threat. I mean, I would be furious and angry and I would never have gotten over that.
It's funny, as a contrast, you're talking about the stories that we keep alive. My grandmother on my dad's side would say, well, camp wasn't so bad. I didn't have to cook. And even though we had to wash our clothes in this icy cold water by hand, it was washing became a time of socialization.
Christina breaking in yet again to say that Chia asked me to say, well, actually, she didn't put it this way, but I'm putting it this way. Sorry for the brain fart. She meant to say socializing, not socialization. It was a time for socializing.
And so we would be able to visit while we were washing clothes together. So I think I'm going to say, especially for my dad's side of the family, I think their Christian faith carried them far in terms of being able to focus on the things that you're grateful for and being able to share that with other people.
So if you had to tell this whole story in like a paragraph,
Is this the experience of Japanese Americans going to camp
or just
or?
your, so I guess I'm just trying to encapsulate this event in your family's history. I mean, the thing I'm picking up here is you guys don't really talk about it that much because it's really not that important to you.
Yes.
And I find that amazing. I find that absolutely amazing, right? Because here you had your mother's side and your father's side, and they had businesses, or they were, you know, in the midst of recovering from escaping from a terrible marriage, doing their own thing. Suddenly they're like public enemy number one after, you know, the bombing at Pearl Harbor, even though they have nothing to do with it in the slightest, just trying to live their lives. They're living in a country that suddenly sees them as the enemy and thinks we have to round them up in a safe place because we don't want to have this enemy from within here attacking us. And then they're locked away for a couple of years in these camps, and they lose what progress they made. They lose a lot of their belongings, they lose a lot of their wealth, and then afterwards, I don't even know what happened afterwards, right? Did they at least bring him back to Los Angeles, or you know, I mean,
I
and then
think so. To answer the question about what happened afterwards, I think they were given a certain amount of money and a train ticket. And I don't know if the train ticket was to anywhere or it was within a certain budget. I'm not sure. I know some people came back to the place that they left.
Christina breaking in to tell you something that Chia asked me to add in. When people were released from this incarceration in 1945, they were given $25, which is equivalent to about 435 US dollars today. And they were given a train ticket to wherever they wanted to go. Okay, we have to remember most of these people had lost their homes, businesses, and savings, and most of them didn't really have good options or a place to come home to. Despite this, only a small number of people chose to immigrate to Japan. And of course, there was a group of people who was forcibly expelled to Japan against their will. But for the most part, most of these unjustly incarcerated people viewing themselves as patriotic Americans, chose to stay in America and work hard to build new lives for themselves.
I think for my family, what they did was they went to places where they could find work because as you can imagine, especially on the West Coast, because then all of the Japanese Americans had been rounded up, the anti-Japanese sentiment was still extremely high. For my father's side, they went to St. Louis. They were able to find work with I believe it was the nephew of Anheuser-Busch. It was the
Yeah, probably. Yeah, if it's St.
Anheuser
Louis.
family, I think it
Yeah.
was. And so my grandfather was like the butler, gardener, did the manly jobs. And then my grandmother was the maid, and she would prepare all the meals and do the laundry and clean the house. And they had living quarters there on premise. So they went there. And then my mother and her mother, so during the course of camp, my grandmother remarried. I'm actually not sure of the details of this, but they moved to Chicago, and my grandfather had money to buy a building, and because all over, I think there was anti-Japanese sentiment that it was not always easy to find a place to rent, and so I think he was able to purchase a building, and then several families, including my dad's family eventually. So
Okay.
apparently there are pictures from way back when of my mom with my auntie and uncle from the other side, for like great auntie and uncle. So
Okay,
yes.
so that's where your parents met.
No, 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 no.
No.
No, no, they happened to live there, but they didn't know each other. I mean, they were
Oh,
children
that's
still.
crazy. I mean, it's still like 100 million, 200 million people in the country, right? So how did they meet? And how did they end up back in Los Angeles?
My father's side, at some point, my grandfather found a job as a draftsman for what was back then being built, the Statler Hotel, which they just tore down apparently in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years or so, and built a new hotel there. So he was a draftsman, and so they moved the entire family out here to Los Angeles. My mom was still very young, and I think ultimately they wanted to be back in Los Angeles.
And so then your parents maybe met like in college
They met in
or
college, so
met in
they met
college.
at LA City College. I think my dad was, well, he went to Occidental College, and so I think he was taking either night, I don't know if they were night classes during the school year or maybe night classes during the summer. So maybe during the summer he was working and taking night classes to add to his not his resume, to add to his,
Transcript. Transcript?
thank you, to his transcript, exactly.
So all of us who have family stories. And these stories sort of like are about their histories, where the family came from, the things the family has been through. And I mean sort of like the big narrative, not like what we did on our summer vacation. Haha, wasn't that funny?
I'll jump in actually because you were asking what the narrative is in a nutshell. You've mentioned that you would be outraged and that, of course it was unjust. But I think at that time and in that day, I think there was much less, I don't want to say analysis, but I think people were just trying to get by. And so if some catastrophe like this happened, people didn't say, well, actually, some people did. For example, I think college students would say, this is not right. Especially, I remember somewhere reading something about this group of Japanese American pre-law students, and they were like, this infringes upon our rights. But I think most Japanese Americans at that time, and there were a high percentage, I think, of immigrants, that they weren't thinking about what was just or not. I think they were just like, okay, well, what's the next step? What do we need to survive? And I think the big picture narrative that I think I would give for, and again, there are so many different stories, I think, for different segments, depending on their age and where they were in their life. Because my family, my grandparents had small children. So really, they were just trying to get by and do the next thing that was going to be the stable thing for their parents. So, or their parents, for their children. So I think when they went into camp, it was really like, okay, what can we do now to prove how American we are? We are not going to speak Japanese. We are going to make sure, even if we gave our kids Japanese names, we're using their American names. And we're going to be in scouts and we're going to go to church and we're going to prove what good Americans we are. And this is important. It's important for me and it's important for you as my neighbor because we're all in this together. And if we're not good Americans, we will be deemed a bad group. So it was really like, I think there was a lot of community effort as a group to be good Americans, to set a good example. And I think there was, I look at especially my dad and his siblings, I think there was a lot of pressure to be model children. And all of them, I think, lived up to that. They all were stellar students. They were active with community service. They were good Christians. They were leaders, and so they really, I think, were able to be model Americans.
Was that a function of the times, or was that a function of, was that like some holdovers of Japanese culture? That's, it's a far more communal culture rather than an individualistic one. Because I'm
Much more
thinking the
so.
individualistic response would be to burn the whole damn thing down and to be angry that this was being done to me and to really focus on that injustice. But maybe I'm looking at this from a very modern lens. But you were really nodding your head when I started talking about a communal culture. So
Yes, in Japan, I would say that there's much more emphasis on getting along, on being part of the community. And it's not to say one is better than the other. You have to understand. One of the benefits of having a system like the Japanese society is that people are very interdependent and your reputation goes a long way. It's both a positive and it's a negative. So if your child does something that is, let's say, illegal or just maybe unneighborly, this reflects really badly on your family. So there's a lot of pressure for kids to do the right thing so that they can, I don't want to say honor, but they can continue to uphold their good family name.
yeah, I could see that there are two sides to that coin. Yeah, I guess you don't really want to speak on behalf of the whole Japanese American community, so I won't ask you if that's what the Japanese American community is like today.
And here's the thing. I think when you're a new immigrant, it's a very different experience than being a second, third, fourth generation. I don't know what you think. So both of my grandmothers were actually second generation Japanese, which means, or you could flip it and say first generation Americans. So they were the first ones in their families born here. My grandfathers both immigrated from Japan. So their children then were kind of like first, second generation Americans, or what we would call second, third generation Japanese. So I'm a third, fourth generation. So because of that, I had the luxury of having parents who grew up here in the United States. I think they had a much more difficult job of bridging that first generation to second generation gap, especially on my dad's side. So even though my grandmother was a first generation American, she did a good job of supporting her first generation husband and honoring the Japanese culture. So they're much more traditional.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking about my family. So, my mother and her mother immigrated in 1947 from Europe, and my mother never thought of herself as anything but American. And I don't know if that's just because it was just my mother and her mother, and they were just completely unencumbered by any sort of culture or family. No one knew them, and they were free to be whoever they could be. Okay, my grandmother spoke with an accent, but my mom, she's you would never have known that English was her second language, and it was the only language that she ever spoke fluently. And so she would, yeah, she didn't think of herself as an immigrant, weirdly. And but I
She
know
was how old when she came here?
she was 5.
I would say then she was American because I always deem it as the what is the bulk of the childhood up through let's say 18. Where did so I think especially like 10 or 12 to 18, like those teenage years I think are so pivotal in forming us that if your mom said, I'm not an immigrant, I'd be like, yeah, you grew up here.
She had no memory of not have she really had basically no memory of having lived in Europe. She just, I find that amazing because, by the time I'm 5, I have tons and tons and tons of memories. But she had just suppressed that, I guess, or not.
I was just going to say maybe because you had good memories.
Yeah, I don't know. But as I said, she had no memories before she came to America. But I know in the Japanese American culture, you guys have a name for each generation. So this is like a key part of a Japanese American identity, is which generation you belong to. I don't know. I know you have names for at least 3 generations.
Yes, so Issei means first generation, so that means Issei means you were born in Japan. Nisei, which is 2, is second generation. Sansei, which is third generation. Yonsei is fourth generation. And I guess you could say Gosei, but I don't know many Goseis. So because I'm third, fourth generation, so my joke in Japanese is always that I'm 3.5 generations, 3.5. And
It
they're
does get tricky calculating this. I mean, I've thought about the same problem because my mom was an immigrant, and but on my dad's side, it was my grandmother who was an immigrant. So I never knew what number I was, but I always figured there was a 0.5 in there somewhere as well. But so is there an understanding of the characteristics, like the psychological characteristics or the challenges or whatever that each of these different groups has? I mean, why
I,
give them names?
well, I think it's just like saying, I mean, the name literally is like first generation, second generation, third
Okay,
generation. So that's all that is. And
okay,
people say in Japanese, that's all. And that I think certainly that the most difficult is the second generation children. And I don't know if you've noticed, it seems like there are a fair number of shows that kind of center around that, that difficulty of the second generation in America. And it could be the parents could be Indian or they could be Korean or they could be, whatever that is, where there are a lot of parents who come to the United States thinking, I want a better life for my child, but my child is still fill in the blank of your culture. And so then it is very important for those, some, I mean, not all, but some of those parents, it's very important that now my child marry a person of our same culture because we are fill in the blank of your
okay. So was
your
there, so there was pressure on your mom and your dad to marry a Japanese American? Yeah, it's good
yes.
they found each other. Less fights that they have to go through. They're also both very amazing, wonderful people.
Thank
So
you. Thank you.
um you could introduce them to anyone and be proud. So
So
then,
yes,
so I was going to ask you how you feel then about us suddenly rounding up immigrants and not really caring whether they're legal or illegal or whatever, turning them into scapegoats and then sending them off to Guantanamo. Okay, it's not analogous to, I guess it's like what happened in World War II, but it's also really different.
it's so much worse.
Oh, obviously, I have my own answer to this question, but how is it worse? Well, it's actually no, it's something that it's not even solving a problem. At least when we quote unquote relocated the people, the Japanese Americans, we were like, oh, they might be loyal to Japan, and so then we have to make sure that they can't sabotage anything. So at least there was it was okay, ridiculous, but it was well defined. But then
Well,
with
and
this round,
there are some that would say that was financially motivated because there
okay,
were a lot of Japanese and Japanese American, mostly Japanese farmers.
so it was a land grab, an intentional land grab. Okay. So that's I'm not arguing against that because I could see how that could have been, but that is a very cynical, that's very cynical. Probably true though.
The current situation seems much less strategic. It's,
It's just pure
yes.
hate.
Well, it's, I'm trying to make myself look good. And so we're going to go and take big actions
Wait, yeah. It's just really designed to make people suffer. And yeah, it is a show.
and
Um
to intimidate.
to
It's a
make
show
people
of power.
afraid. Yeah, to make people afraid.
Bullies are really good at that.
Unfortunately, until someone stands up to them. So So have you ever gone to visit one of these? Actually, I don't know if any of them are still standing outside of Manzanar, any of these relocation camps. Have you ever gone to Gila, Arizona, or
No, I have been to the Japanese American Museum in downtown Los Angeles, and they took, I can't remember now if it was from Manzanar or from Heart Mountain, but they took one of the barracks and they reconstructed it in the museum just to
and so
show what that was like.
so what was that like emotionally for you to go visit this place?
I think it's one of those things. I can't remember when I first went. I might have been in my 30s, maybe earlier 30s. I think as I age, and I think this is probably the normal development of a person, not just me, but I think as we age, we gain more perspective. And as I am older and older, I'm more appreciative of my grandparents and for their strength and that they were able to not hold on to that bitterness and that I grew up not knowing probably how terrible that whole experience was.
I was in my 40s when I visited Manzanar, and I wasn't there for very long, maybe just like an hour or so. I was there with my mom and my husband because we were staying in Lone Pine. It's just outside of Lone Pine. My mom wasn't really patient with the whole thing. I think, because her father died in a concentration camp, I think she just didn't have any patience for the relocation camps here. And we wandered through for a little bit. They have a nice exhibition showing like pictures of the people who had been forced to live there, and pictures of like the high school dances they had put on a prom, and it's exactly what you were describing, this like trying to be very good American citizens, very well behaved, making the most of this situation to show that they were worthy people and worthy of being Americans. Actually, not that Americans were doing a great job of that at the time, because America at that time was incredibly racist. So my dad's side of the family, they're Mexican, and but half of them are white passing, and the other half of them is a little more obvious that they're Mexican. And so they were like dressing up as pachucos, and they were getting beaten up by the Navy servicemen, and it was in Los Angeles. It was a hectic time. You didn't even have to be like and look like the enemy to be treated badly by white people. There was a lot of xenophobia. But anyway, so I was, just in, I don't know if it was 1 hour or 3 hours. No, it wasn't 3 hours. My mom wasn't that patient. But we walked around, we looked at the barracks, and you're standing out here, you're in the middle of this like desolate valley in between the mountains. The mountains look beautiful, but you couldn't have gone there. You were trapped in this camp. And then they just had pictures of these little kids all dressed up and dressed nicely and going to school and sitting politely at their desks. And that just killed me. I had to walk out in tears. I was so upset that people would do this to little children, even though, okay, nobody was getting murdered, but still, it just really, really upset me. Because it was so outrageous and ridiculous and wrong. Yeah. And I don't think, and I think most of us as Americans were like, oh, we didn't do that. That was people before us. or that was the government or whatever. And I don't think we've ever thought about like, oh, that was a bad thing to do, and we did that. I think there's lip service. We give lip service to it. Like, oh, that was terrible, but nobody says like, how did our society decide to do that? You
There
know?
was a formal apology,
What? It took them
and,
decades. It was
and
only a couple years ago.
no, it was when we were in college.
Was it that early? Okay, so it was Bill
I know
Clinton.
we're not that old. That was just a few years ago.
Okay, it was not Bill Clinton. It was actually George H.W. Bush. So he formally apologized on December 7th, 1991. That was the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And what he said was, "In remembering, it is important to come to grips with the past. No nation can fully understand itself or find its place in the world if it does not look with clear eyes at all the glories and disgraces of its past. We in the United States acknowledge such an injustice in our history. The internment of Americans of Japanese ancestry was a great injustice, and it will never be repeated." Of course, fine print there, of course, is won't be repeated with Japanese Americans, but, maybe with somebody else.
It did take a long time, but it was really important. For the people that I know, it was really important because you're right. Up until then, although people would have that little like, you were here, your family was here from Los Angeles, or in California. What camp did you go to? They would have that kind of talk, but really, people did not talk about camp because it was kind of a disgraceful thing that you had gone through this ordeal and your family you'd been considered an enemy. And so it was something that it was really people didn't want to talk about. And then after the formal apology, then it was suddenly like, oh, okay, so now we can talk about that because we weren't in the wrong. We didn't do anything wrong.
So,
So,
was it important to your parents? I don't know if your grandmother she was still alive when this
oh
happened?
yeah, yeah, all my grandparents were still alive. So I think it was very important for my grandparents. I think maybe it was still important to my parents and to their, my aunts and uncles, in that that's part of our family history. And so to now have that part cleared, which was an injustice was done to our family, we were treated as enemies and rounded up, and we had this big disruption in our life. So I think it was important to everyone. I think maybe for our generation, because even before the formal apology, I think we could have clearly seen that was ridiculous. It was completely unjust. That was, I think that's more easily recognized as history becomes history. It's
Okay.
it's easier to understand what the right side was.
Yeah,
The
when the
country was
emotions
in
die down.
Yeah, the country was in hysterics. Would not be surprised to hear that a group of people were able to turn this in their favor and to gain from that. And it's easy to see now in retrospect. Oh yeah, that wasn't right.
So, your family is able to look back at what they went through and be proud of themselves for having endured it and having dealt with it so gracefully?
I don't think they're proud of themselves though. I think they would say they were blessed in many ways, in those times when they were able to take a solid step. I think just like having one thing lead to the next and to not lose it, I think then that becomes a celebration. Yeah, I don't think they would ever say they were proud of themselves. I think they would just say, we did what we had to do and support each other. So, like, just as an example, and this wasn't, again, I think the community's very intertwined and kind of gain strength from each other. My father's family, for example, were very, very involved with their church. Whenever they would hear that, oh, there's someone coming from Japan and they're going to study here or whatever, they need a place to live. And so my grandparents would have a meeting and say, well, we're here to have a family meeting to discuss whether or not we would like to have, Yoji-san come and live with us for the next 2 years because he needs a place to stay and da-da. And so now we're going to vote. I forgot to tell you part of the story. Part of the story was actually, so I said, my family, my dad's side had a dairy farm. I had forgotten that actually before the war started, my grandfather had and grandmother had gone to Japan because I think they were going to try and make a life for themselves there. Totally forgot this. And my grandmother was pregnant at the time with my dad. So that would have been 1937. And then they were in Japan. My grandfather was he was working as a salesman, I think. And then when the war broke, well, let's see. So I think this was when Japan was building up its military and they were starting to, venture outside their country and attack other countries. And my grandfather was actually drafted. And so they said, oh, we don't want you going off to war. So they hopped on a boat and they came back to the United States. And they later found out, I think he must have been drafted alongside other people. They would draft like maybe by location. So I think they knew other young men who actually were drafted and then put on a specific boat, and that boat ended up being sunk, and all the men died.
Ooh.
And so it was very lucky that they returned back to the United States. So I also don't know how much of the lesser of two evils. So get shipped off to a relocation camp, but at least he wasn't on that boat and he died in Japan.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then that's true. Then not fighting in the war at all. So most of my dad's uncles ended up in the Navy and in the Pacific. They were in a lot of battles, but they all came home. They never talked about what happened, the things that happened.
I forgot to mention, so I had said that my maternal grandmother came from Seattle with my mother and came to Los Angeles and to visit her brother. So her brother, the three of them, they went to camp, and he was looking for a way to make his life better because he said they weren't getting enough to eat and they were hungry all the time. And so he was looking for work or some way to make money while he was there. And I think one of the things was if you helped out in the kitchen, you could get extra rations of food. So when the opportunity came up and they were taking volunteers for the army, he volunteered right away. And because he was bilingual, he was born in Seattle, but he ended up spending his formative years in Japan. So he was completely bilingual. And so he was drafted into the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service. And interestingly, his mother and his other brothers were in Japan, in Hiroshima. And so he was fighting against his brothers in World War II. This Uncle Harry, went to the Philippines and he was part of the unit that was cracking code there, intercepting the Japanese messages and translating them. When the war ended, he was on the first boat with General MacArthur to go to Japan to receive the Emperor's surrender. And you can read all about it in a book called Midnight in Broad Daylight.
How did he feel when he heard about the atomic bombs dropped on?
Well, of course, he was very worried about his family. And as soon as he had his first days off, he took a Jeep and he drove down to Hiroshima to look for his family. And so he went to get into the Jeep. And of course, he realized this is going to look really bad if a Caucasian army person is driving me and I'm the higher up sitting in the back with my hat on. So he switched hats with the driver, and he told him, "You're going to ride in the back and you're going to pretend like you're my superior. So if anyone sees us or stops us, it will look like you're forcing me to drive you around."
Oh my God, I can't even imagine how horrified he must have been by what he saw. I mean, that must have been overwhelming. Like, okay, especially if that had been a place he had lived. I mean, and the worried. So did he, what happened to his family?
They were okay. I think from the time that he'd gotten into the military, I think he had not written or sent anything to his family. So she did not know he was in the military, and she did not know, of course, he'd come to Japan. And when she first saw him and he entered the room, she thought he was a ghost, and she thought perhaps he died, and this was his ghost coming to visit.
Oh God, all the mixed feelings there. You've just had a bomb dropped on you. This is the enemy, but then here is your relative who's not dead but is in an army uniform. I can't even begin to unpack that scene. But then again, is your family, so they must have handled it with grace.
So there's another funny little story, which is that these great uncles, they were born in Seattle. They grew up there for some time, and then they went back to Japan. One of the younger, Uncle Harry's younger brother, Uncle Frank, was there in Hiroshima, and Uncle Harry said, come to Tokyo with me because we need more translators, because the army, the forces are coming in, and we're trying to help rebuild everything, but we don't have enough bilingual. So, and Uncle Frank says, "Well, I don't speak English," because he was 4 years younger. Is that how much younger he was? 3 or 4 years younger. So he was probably closer to 7 or 8 when he went back to Japan. And so then he completely had, well, and especially during that time, because it was very imperialistic and anything foreign was bad. And so part of the reason Uncle Harry came back to the United States after living in Japan for a number of years, through, junior high into high school, he got beat up every day because he didn't speak perfect Japanese. And so what does this sound like? "Hey, what's wrong with you? How come you don't speak Japanese like us? Hey, let's get him. He's a foreigner."
That's crazy.
So he got beat up every day after school. And
Okay.
his stories were about trying to escape and run away so he wouldn't get caught and beat up by these kids. And so anyway, so his younger brother was much younger, and so he kind of was just able to, like, English, don't need that anymore. All Japanese. I am Japanese through and through, right? And so he said, I don't remember anything. And he says, "Don't worry, just come with me. You'll pick it back up." And so, of course, this is my great uncle. And so when I went to Japan for the first time to meet him, I was in my early 20s. And he sounded like any other man of his generation in the United States, did not have a single accent, had all of those old school colloquialisms. And he's very charming and outgoing. But it was funny that you would have never have known that he had ever forgotten his English. And he said, yeah, it came back. He went up there, and at first it was really hard because he could hear the words, but they weren't really, he wasn't processing them. But then it all came back, and yeah, so that
That
was
is remarkable because my mom never got her French back. And and when she would say things, so I lived in France for a little bit. I won't say I learned the language, but I learned enough of it. And she would say things and I'd be like, oh my God, that accent is so bad. And you don't know what you're saying. Or or someone would say something in French and she wouldn't catch it, and I'd be like, how can you not understand that? That is so basic. So that's impressive. That's really impressive that he was able to build that back up. Wow. So you have a very complicated family legacy here in with this war. And yet again, I'm so impressed at how gracefully you guys have all come through it. And it gives me hope that we will get through the next few years and life will go on and we will recover and reestablish ourselves and forget about these
amen.
times. These times will become history. We just have to fight our way through and remain true to what we believe and work
I,
together.
I feel like in Germany, I feel like there's been a very concerted and clear effort to recognize the past.
Yeah, they've just thrown that out the window. I actually was very proud of the Germans for the work they had done on, asking themselves, how did we do that? How did we behave so monstrously and do these terrible things? And how do we not do that again? And until this last couple years, I would have said amazing. The transformation has been amazing. But now they're all voting for the neo-Nazi party. So like 20% of the people. And I realize a lot of it is brainwashing, misinformation on social media. A lot of it said that you always have this far right element in society, and normally it just kind of lurks under rocks and doesn't show its face because it knows it's disapproved of. But part of it is also this growing inequality, wealth inequality, and people are angry, and the normal parties who should have been looking after the common people kind of abandoned them. The social democrats and abandoned the working people, and so the welfare benefits have been terrible compared to what they used to be, because they've been tightening all the budgets, and they haven't been investing in the roads, and they haven't been investing in the bridges, and they haven't been investing in the rail service, they haven't been sufficiently investing in the healthcare. Unions power got eroded a bit, wages went down, pensions have gone down, and so people are angry. And why would they keep voting for the parties who promised to represent them when they haven't been represented? Everyone's been like, oh, we got to save the banks, we got to save Volkswagen, we've got to save the economy, we've got to balance the budget at the expense of all these people. In the meantime, we need tax breaks for rich people and big companies. And so people feel betrayed. So it's complicated. So I have sympathy, but on the other hand, I'm like, nah, don't vote for the far right. That's not really the answer, because it just makes it worse. But as we're seeing in America today, that's really not the right answer. That just makes the problem astronomically worse. Okay, but I really should let you go on with your day. So thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, stay Solarpunk. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.